Today I want to take a look at something that other content creators seemingly won't touch. I'm going to attempt to answer the question that I'm sure a lot of people have, and I know I had when I was building my current gaming PC. What hardware do I need to run DCS World? First, I'll go over the basics for what you have to run DCS World and what those actually mean, because they are kind of old. Then I will compare two systems that both run DCS World and see if I can come up with some performance figures for you. Eagle Dynamics, as you can see here, has 3 tiers of hardware recommendations, but the problem is the recommended hardware is pretty old at the time of recording, so I'm going to suggest some newer hardware that compares favorably against ED's recommendations. Their minimum requirements are a CPU at 2.8 GHz, 120 gigabytes of storage space, 8 gigabytes of RAM or 16 for heavy missions, and a GTX 760 graphics card or the AMD equivalent. For the purposes of explanation, I'll assume the monitor resolution is 1920 by 1080. As far as processors are concerned, any modern processor like the i3-12100 or Ryzen 3 3100 are what I would recommend here for new systems, and for older hardware just make sure it has at least 2 processing cores and a base clock of at least 2.8 GHz. RAM is an area that I really think needs some explanation because DCS used to run with 8 GB of RAM just fine, but it has developed to the point where you really need 16 GB at a minimum. The GTX 760 is a pretty old graphics card, so I'll just name a few more recent cards that I know run DCS just fine. These are the GTX 1050 Ti, the GTX 1650 and 1660, the RTX 3050, and the RX 5500 XT and 6500 XT. All these cards are quite a bit faster than the 760 and can run DCS on low settings without any issue. For high settings, Eagle Dynamics recommends an i5 or Ryzen processor at 3 GHz or higher, 16 GB of RAM, and a GTX 1070 or better. Now here's how that translates into more modern hardware, again assuming 1080p resolution. Modern processors like the i5-12400 or 12600K and the Ryzen 5 3600 and 5600X are entirely adequate for DCS at this point, and similar processors a couple of generations back are powerful enough as well. Again, I think RAM is undershot here. Realistically, you're going to need 32 GB for DCS unless you only play single player in my experience. The GTX 1070 is also pretty old, and I would recommend something more along the lines of the RTX 3060 or the AMD RX 6650 for new build systems. ED's hardware specs for VR are essentially the same as the ones for high settings with the exception of the graphics card. They recommend a GTX 1080 or better, and realistically today that would translate into an RTX 2070 or 3070 or an RX 5700 XT. So now I have some benchmarking for you. The first system I'll be testing is my own gaming rig, which has an RTX 3060 graphics card with 12 GB of VRAM, a Ryzen 5 1600AF processor running at 3.2 GHz base with a boost clock of 3.6 GHz, a solid-state boot drive, and 32 GB of DDR4 random access memory at 3200 MHz. I put together 2 benchmarks using the F-15 Eagle on the Caucasus map with terrain progressing from open to rugged forest. The first one is set in the early morning, and the second is set later in the morning with 2 MiG-23s to make the F-15 have to maneuver. I first flew each benchmark and recorded a track file, and then replayed the track using the NVIDIA performance slotting feature to obtain the average frame rate. My personal rig performs well at 1080p with the high settings preset, with an average frame rate of 59.3 and 1% lows averaging 45 FPS in the early morning benchmark. The more intense daytime benchmark saw the average frame rate drop slightly to 57.3, with the 1% lows averaging 40.5 FPS. Not everybody has an RTX 3060 and 32 GB of RAM, so I also tested a system that should give me a good idea of what lower-end hardware is capable of these days. I also just happen to have a gaming laptop with an i5 11400H, 16 GB of DDR4 3200, and an RTX 3050 mobile graphics card. Since laptops have a harder time cooling their hardware and I need this one to last, I typically have the frame rate artificially limited to 30 FPS, but for benchmarking, I removed the limiter. The laptop blew me away with its performance at 1080p on low settings, with an average frame rate in the morning benchmark of 73.8 and 1% lows averaging 56.1 FPS. Interestingly, the laptop performs slightly better in the daytime benchmark, with frame rate averaging 75.4 FPS and 1% lows averaging 57.9 FPS. The only thing I can think is that it may be something to do with having an Intel processor instead of an AMD one, as Intel processors are optimized a bit differently. Thanks for watching. I hope this gives you some idea of what hardware you need to run DCS, and as always, please like and subscribe for more content, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, I'd love to hear them in my Discord server or in the comments down below.